Harden County, Ohio, February 11th, 1921, 2 in the afternoon. The ground above the chamber had dropped 18 inches overnight. Not slumped, dropped. A clean vertical subsidence across a roughly circular area approximately 30 feet in diameter, the edges of the depression sharp and defined, the floor of it level and compacted rather than loose and fallen. Walter Grimes had been assessing structural damage claims for the Central Ohio Mutual Insurance Company since 1909, and in 12 years he had seen every variety of ground failure that farming and construction in Central Ohio could produce. Frost heave, drain tile collapse, abandoned well failure, undermined foundations. He had never seen a subsidence with edges that sharp and a floor that level. Natural ground collapse was irregular and chaotic. This looked engineered. This looked like something underneath had been removed and the surface had settled onto what remained. He was 38 years old. He had a degree in civil engineering from Ohio State University, class of 1907, and a second qualification in structural assessment that Central Ohio Mutual had required when they promoted him to senior adjuster in 1914. He drove to the Harden County site, a farm 7 miles south of Kenton, owned by a 63-year-old man named Arthur Prentice, in response to a damage claim Prentice had filed the previous day. Prentice had woken on the morning of February 10th to find the depression in his east pasture. He had walked down to it, looked at it, gone back to the farmhouse, and filed the claim before noon. He told the claims office it was a sinkhole. Walter Grimes drove out to assess it and knew within 5 minutes it was not a sinkhole. He stood at the edge of the depression for a while, looking at it. Then he went back to his automobile and got his measuring tape and his assessment notebook and went to work. But here is what the Central Ohio Mutual Insurance Company, the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society, and the United States Bureau of Mines have spent 104 years making sure you never ask about. Harden County occupies the flat glacial till plain of central Ohio, drained by the Scioto and Blanchard rivers, with a subsurface geology dominated by the same limestone formations that underlie most of western Ohio's agricultural heartland. The county had been intensively mounded before European settlement. The surveys conducted by the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society in the 1880s and 1890s had cataloged 41 mound sites within the county boundaries, making it one of the more densely mounded counties in the Scioto drainage. By 1921, most of those mound sites had been plowed flat over decades of agricultural clearing, their earthen cores dispersed into the surrounding fields, their burial contents turned up seasonally by the plow and mostly unreported. What the plow had been turning up at the surface was the upper material of the mound fills. What lay beneath the fill, in the limestone substrate, had not been reached by any agricultural operation. The Prentice Farm East Pasture sat on a section of the county that the 1889 Archaeological Society survey had marked as containing a large platform mound, subsequently plowed down by the farm's previous owners in the 1890s. The survey notation described the mound as having an unusual flat-topped profile, consistent with a constructed platform rather than a burial mound, approximately 12 feet high before plowing, with an earthen fill composition different from the surrounding glacial till. The Society's field notes for that survey section, which are in the Society's archive in Columbus, described the platform mound as possibly covering a subsurface structure. The field surveyor who made the notation was a 44-year-old man named Raymond Oakes, who had been doing mound survey work for the Society since 1881. He had noted possible subsurface structure at other platform mound sites in Ohio and Indiana, and had never been wrong about it. The notation was filed and not followed up. The mound was plowed down. The subsurface structure, if it existed, was left undisturbed below the plow line. Raymond Oakes, who had made the 1889 survey notation about the Prentice Farm platform mound, had spent his career systematically documenting evidence that the official archaeological record was unwilling to accommodate. He was not a fringe figure. He had been appointed to the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society's survey program by its director, and had conducted fieldwork across 12 Ohio counties between 1881 and 1896. He was 52 years old and had been working mound sites for 15 years when he noted the platform mound at the Prentice Farm location. He had seen enough platform mounds across the Scioto drainage to know that the ones with flat tops and unusual fill compositions were categorically different from standard burial mounds. They were not burial platforms. They were architectural covers, surface structures designed to mark and protect something below, rather than to contain something within the earthen fill itself. He had noted this distinction in a report he submitted to the Society's director in 1891, after completing the Harden County survey and several subsequent surveys in adjacent counties where the same platform mound type appeared. The report argued that the platform mound type represented a distinct construction category, requiring a different investigative approach, not excavation of the mound fill, which would produce only the fill material, but subsurface investigation of the limestone substrate below the mound's footprint, which might reveal the structures the mounds were built to mark. The report was filed and not acted on. The Society's director at the time was committed to a program of mound survey and fill excavation that had been producing results: burial goods, skeletal material, the documentation of Adena and Hopewell mortuary practice, and a methodological argument for a different investigative approach was not a priority. Oakes continued with the survey program. He retired in 1896. His report proposing subsurface investigation of platform mound sites is in the Society's administrative files for 1891. No subsequent investigation of any platform mound site in Ohio has followed the approach he proposed. Walter Grimes did not know about the 1,889 survey notation when he arrived at the Prentice farm on February 11, 1921. He knew what he saw: a circular subsidence with sharp edges and a level floor, the kind of collapse profile that resulted when an underground void lost its supporting arch, and the surface settled onto the rubble at the void's floor. He had seen this pattern twice before, both times over abandoned mine drifts in southern Ohio, where the drift timbers had finally rotted and the roof had let go. The collapse profile was the same. What was different was the scale. The subsidence above the Prentice farm was 30 feet in diameter. The mine collapses he had seen previously were 8 and 12 feet across. Whatever was below the Prentice pasture was significantly larger than an abandoned mine drift. Arthur Prentice had not immediately recognized what he was looking at either, when he walked down to the depression on the morning of February 10th. He was a man who had farmed that land for 31 years, who had walked every acre of it in every season, and who understood the particular character of his East Pasture's ground the way a farmer understands the ground he has worked for 3 decades. He told Grimes, when Grimes arrived, that the depression had not been there the previous afternoon. He had walked the East Pasture fence line at 4 o'clock on February 9th, checking for winter damage to the wire, and the ground had been level and undisturbed. He had gone to bed at 9 and woken at 7, and looked out the kitchen window and seen the depression in the morning light. It had happened between 4 in the afternoon and 7 the following morning. 15 hours. The collapse of a 31-foot underground vault roof in 15 hours is not a gradual process. Something had changed in the support structure of the chamber's ceiling on the afternoon or evening of February 9th, and the surface had dropped in the night. Prentice told Grimes he had heard nothing. His farmhouse was 300 yards from the East Pasture. Whatever sound the collapse made, if it made any, had not reached him. Grimes noted this in his field assessment. Collapse occurred between approximately 4 in the afternoon on February 9th and 7 in the morning on February 10th, approximately 15 hours. No sound reported by property owner. He noted it because the timing was professionally significant. A collapse that produced no audible event at 300 yards suggested a void whose walls had absorbed or damped the collapse energy, rather than transmitting it as a concussive shock wave. A natural sinkhole collapse in limestone, at that scale, typically produced a sound describable as a low report or a deep thud, audible at distances of up to half a mile in flat terrain. The Prentice East Pasture collapse had been silent at 300 yards. The walls of whatever was below had held while the ceiling gave way. He took his measurements. The depression was 31 feet at its widest diameter, 28 feet at the perpendicular. The vertical drop from the surrounding pasture grade to the floor of the depression was 17 inches at the deepest point. The edges were sharp within approximately 2 inches. The surface had not slumped gradually but had dropped cleanly, the way a trapdoor drops. The floor of the depression was compacted and level, suggesting it was resting on something solid rather than on loose fill. He noted all of this in his assessment notebook. He noted the engineered appearance. He noted that the collapse profile was inconsistent with natural sinkhole formation, which would produce an irregular bowl shape with gradual edges. He noted that the profile was consistent with the surface settling onto the rubble from the collapse of a large underground void's roof. He wrote in his notebook, "Subsidence inconsistent with sinkhole, consistent with underground chamber collapse. Recommend geological investigation before claim assessment." He showed Arthur Prentice what he had written. Prentice looked at it. He asked what geological investigation meant. Grimes said it meant bringing in someone who could determine whether there was a chamber or void below the surface. Prentice asked who that would be. Grimes said the Bureau of Mines or the State Geological Survey. Prentice said he didn't want anyone digging in his pasture. Grimes said the investigation didn't necessarily require digging. Prentice said he wanted to know if the insurance covered the pasture damage. Grimes said he couldn't make a determination until he understood the cause. He drove back to the Central Ohio Mutual office in Columbus and filed his preliminary assessment. Claim deferred pending geological investigation, subsidence cause undetermined, profile inconsistent with standard sinkhole formation. He attached his measurements and his field notes. He submitted the assessment to his supervisor, a 51-year-old man named Charles Dent, who had been managing claims at Central Ohio Mutual since 1903. Dent called him into his office the following morning. He told Grimes that the Prentice claim had been flagged overnight by the company's regional director and that the preliminary assessment needed to be revised. Grimes asked in what direction. Dent told him the revised assessment should characterize the subsidence as a natural sinkhole resulting from dissolved limestone substrate, a standard cause for which the policy provided coverage, and that the geological investigation recommendation should be removed. Grimes asked why. Dent said the regional director had received a communication from a federal office regarding the Prentice farm claim, and that the company was being asked to process it as a standard sinkhole without further investigation. Grimes asked which federal office. Dent said he didn't know. Grimes said he couldn't sign an assessment he knew to be inaccurate. Dent told him he should think carefully about that position. Walter Grimes thought carefully about it. He revised the assessment. He characterized the subsidence as a natural sinkhole consistent with dissolved limestone substrate. He removed the geological investigation recommendation. He signed the revised assessment and submitted it. Arthur Prentice received his settlement check 3 weeks later. The claim was closed. Walter Grimes kept his original preliminary assessment. He kept his field notes. He kept his measurement record. He did not destroy the original documents when he revised the assessment. He put them in a folder in the bottom drawer of his desk at the Central Ohio Mutual office and left them there for 11 years, until he left the company in 1932, following a dispute over a different matter, at which point he took the folder with him. The instruction to revise the assessment had not been in writing. The communication from the federal office that Dent had mentioned had not been disclosed to Grimes in any form he could document. What Grimes had, in the folder he carried out of the Central Ohio Mutual office in 1932, was his original assessment, his field notes, and his measurements. That was sufficient. He kept the folder through 2 moves and a second career as a structural engineer in private practice in Columbus. When he retired in 1951, he donated his professional papers, 30 years of engineering assessments, structural reports, and correspondence, to the Ohio State University's Knowlton School of Architecture Library, which had been collecting professional engineering papers for its historical archive. The Prentice Farm folder went with the donation. The Knowlton School's finding aid lists the Grimes collection as Professional Papers, Walter Grimes, Structural Engineer, Columbus, Ohio, 1909 through 1951. The Prentice Farm Assessment is in the collection, original and revised versions both, with the field notes and the measurement record. The finding aid notes the collection as containing materials related to structural damage assessment and ground failure in Central Ohio. The collection is accessible by appointment. The Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society's 1889 survey notation for the Prentice Farm section, the notation by Raymond Oakes describing a platform mound with possible subsurface structure, is in the Society's mound survey records for Harden County in the Society's archive in Columbus. Oakes had made the notation and moved on to the next survey section, as the protocol of a countywide mound survey required. He had not returned to investigate. The notation sat in the survey record for 32 years before the surface above it collapsed, and a structural engineer from Columbus arrived with a measuring tape. The survey record is in the archive. Oakes's field notes for the 1889 Harden County survey are with the record. The connection between his notation and Grimes's 1921 assessment has not been drawn in any published study of either collection. The Tartarian framework places the chamber below the Prentice Farm East Pasture in the same category as the sealed underground structures documented across the Ohio and Scioto River drainages in the period 1870 through 1930. A constructed underground space of significant scale, built in the limestone substrate beneath the glacial till plain of central Ohio, sealed and forgotten until agricultural and construction activity began reaching its level. The platform mound above it had been, in this framework, the surface marker for a subsurface structure whose builders understood that a prominent earthen platform above ground would preserve the ground above an underground chamber by preventing casual agricultural disturbance. The mound had done its job for an unknown number of centuries. The plow had finally taken the mound in the 1,890 seconds. The chamber below had survived the plowing by being below the plow line. It survived until the winter of 1921, when whatever supported its ceiling finally gave way and the surface dropped 18 inches onto the rubble of its own roof. The global parallel is the hypogeum at Hal Saflieni in Malta, a multi-level underground complex cut into limestone at depths between 5 and 11 meters, discovered in 1902 when construction workers broke through its ceiling during foundation work for a housing project. The Hal Saflieni ceiling collapse in 1902 produced a drop in the surface grade above it that the construction workers initially described as a sinkhole. It was not a sinkhole. It was the ceiling of a constructed space. The Harden County collapse in 1921 produced a drop in the surface grade above it that Walter Grimes's revised assessment characterized as a sinkhole. It was not a sinkhole. The structural engineer who assessed it said so in writing before he was told to say otherwise. Charles Dent, the Central Ohio Mutual supervisor who delivered the instruction to revise the assessment, retired from the company in 1929 and died in 1941. He left no written account of the February 1921 communication from the federal office. He mentioned it once, according to his son Edward Dent, who gave a recorded account to the researcher Gordon Ashby in 2019. Edward Dent was 81 years old at the time of the interview and had been 12 years old in 1921. He remembered his father coming home from the office on the evening of February 12th in an unusual state, quiet, preoccupied, not responsive to the ordinary household conversation at the dinner table. His father was not normally a quiet man. Edward had asked his mother what was wrong. His mother had said his father had received a communication at work that had put him in an unusual position and that he didn't want to talk about it. Edward had not thought about that dinner again until 2019, when Ashby contacted him after finding the Grimes assessment in the Knowlton School archive and tracing Dent's name from the company records. Edward said his father had mentioned the Prentice Farm matter only once in his life, in approximately 1935, in the context of a conversation about professional ethics. His father had said there were situations in insurance work where a man received instructions that he knew to be professionally wrong and had to decide how much his livelihood was worth relative to his integrity. He had said he had once made the wrong choice and that he thought about it. Edward Dent said he had not known, until Ashby contacted him, what specific situation his father had been referring to. The recorded interview is in Ashby's research archive in Morgantown, West Virginia. The land above the Prentice Farm East Pasture is currently held by a Delaware-registered limited liability company that acquired the parcel, now separated from the rest of the original Prentice Farm through a series of estate divisions and agricultural consolidations, in 1978. The company holds 18 acres, the acreage that includes the depression site and the surrounding 50-foot buffer. No agricultural activity has been conducted on the 18 acres since the acquisition. The parcel carries a no trespassing notice on the county road frontage, posted on a metal signboard that was replaced in 2017. A camera mounted on a fence post overlooking the depression area was installed in 2021, 100 years after Grimes stood at the edge and measured the drop. The camera is newer than the sign. The sign is newer than the fence. The fence has been there since at least 1979, the first year it appears in the Harden County Assessor's property inspection photographs. A Freedom of Information request filed in the autumn of 2022 by the independent researcher Harold Vance, requesting all Bureau of Mines records relating to Harden County, Ohio, for the period 1919 through 1925, produced a response confirming that Bureau records from this period were held at the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland, and that a search of indexed records had found no entries for Harden County in the requested period. Vance filed a follow-up request for the Bureau's unindexed correspondence files for the same period, which would capture communications that had not been formally entered into the Bureau's standard administrative record. The response to the follow-up, received 6 months later, stated that unindexed correspondence files from this period had been subject to a routine records disposition in the 1960s, and that materials not scheduled for permanent retention had been destroyed. The communication that Charles Dent described to Walter Grimes on the morning of February 12, 1921, the communication from a federal office that caused Central Ohio Mutual's regional director to instruct a structural engineer to characterize a chamber collapse as a sinkhole, is in no accessible record. It is in Dent's description to Grimes, which is in Grimes's memory as he recorded it in the original assessment notes, which are in the Knowlton School Archive at Ohio State University in Columbus. The archive is open on weekdays. The chamber at the Prentice farm did not disappear when the ceiling collapsed. The collapse of a vault ceiling deposits the ceiling material on the floor of the vault but does not destroy the vault's walls or its contents. Whatever was on the floor of the chamber below the Prentice East Pasture in February 1921 was covered by approximately 17 inches of collapsed ceiling material. It was not removed. No one went down to remove it. The insurance claim was processed as a sinkhole. The depression was left as it was, and by the following spring the pasture grass had grown back over the edges of the depression, and the Prentice farm returned to its ordinary agricultural routine. The depression itself was still visible in aerial photographs of the farm taken in the 1940s and 1950s. By the 1960s, repeated frost cycles and the accumulation of blown topsoil had softened its edges. By the time the Delaware LLC acquired the parcel in 1978, the surface evidence of the 1921 collapse was visible only as a slight irregularity in the field grade, the kind of irregularity that a man walking the land might notice, and a man driving past would not. Walter Grimes, 38 years old, February 11, 1921. He stood at the edge of the depression in Arthur Prentice's East Pasture in the February cold, and looked at the edges that were too sharp, and the floor that was too level, and he knew what he was looking at. He had his measuring tape in his hand, and his notebook open to a fresh page. He was a structural engineer. He measured what was in front of him. He wrote what the measurements said. He revised the assessment when he was told to. He kept the original. The original is in Columbus, in the Knowlton School Archive, with the field notes and the measurement record and the notation that says what the depression actually was. The chamber below it is still there, under 17 inches of its own collapsed ceiling, in the limestone substrate of Harden County, Ohio, waiting for the first investigator who arrives with the right instruments and the right question. The barber in Muskingum County who kept a skull in the back room for 30 years was less than 40 miles to the east. He and Grimes never met. The thing the barber kept and the thing the chamber held are from the same civilization and the same suppression. The distance between them is an afternoon's drive. The Ohio State University's Knowlton School of Architecture library is on the Columbus campus, accessible to researchers by appointment through the university's library system. The Grimes professional papers are cataloged under Structural Engineering, Central Ohio, 20th century. The finding aid lists the collection as 43 folders spanning 1909 through 1951. The Prentice Farm folder is described in the finding aid as Harden County Structural Damage Assessment, February 1921, including field notes and 2 assessment versions. The description is accurate. The 2 assessment versions, the original, which says what the depression was, and the revised, which says what Grimes was told to say it was, are both in the folder, side by side, both signed, both dated. A researcher who requests the folder and reads both versions can see exactly what happened in the Central Ohio Mutual office on the morning of February 12, 1921, without any additional documentation. The original says, subsidence inconsistent with sinkhole, consistent with underground chamber collapse. The revised says, natural sinkhole resulting from dissolved limestone substrate. The 2 documents are separated by 1 day and 1 conversation with a supervisor who had received a communication from a federal office whose name Grimes never learned. The folder has been in the Knowlton School since 1951. It has been accessible since it was processed and cataloged. No researcher has requested it for the purpose of connecting it to the broader pattern of Ohio Valley chamber suppression in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The folder is in Columbus. The chamber is in Harden County. The distance between them is 60 miles and